So when we think of Western philosophy, and I think it's important that we are clear to specify, which we tend to not do, the invisibility, and we take for granted, of the origins of these thoughts. Who are, let's say, the 8 most venerated Western philosophers and thinkers that provides the foundation of Western thought? We can perhaps start with Socrates from ancient Greece, considered as the father of Western philosophy, followed by Plato. And with the Western philosophy, there's one trick that I learned that was quite helpful. Think of the acronym SPA, S-P-A. So you have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And when you take a course on Western philosophy, this is usually where it starts. Does that mean that this is the 0 point of thought? Of course not. They are the pre-Socratics. But in essence, this is a very important starting point for how everything is kind of built up. So after Aristotle, we move directly all the way into the 17th century to Immanuel Kant with his critique of pure reason. And here, he's known for epistemology and ethics. So the question of how to know what you know. And then, of course, ethics. And from this, we start with the questions of categorical imperative, trying to take certain actions and see how it can be universally applied. But this, we can see how quickly we run into trouble, because what is universalism? How do you define and choose different preferences? And it's a question worthy of consideration. However, it seems to constantly leave out the existence of other people, other cultures, other civilizations. Moving on, we have René Descartes from France. We have Friedrich Nietzsche from Germany, David Hume from Scotland, and John Locke from England. So all of this is to see how centralized the people are, and even the gender of the main thoughts that provides the backbone for our governance, for our technology, for our thinking, in every sense. It doesn't mean that it's all wrong, but it's important to highlight the starting points from which we will look, and for this book, the actual examination of one word, Shengren. So let's start with this chapter. It starts with the question, how is our Western civilization, which is dominated by Greek tradition and Christianity, how is a non-Christian philosophy possible? The question is unanswerable, or rather, the answer must be no. A non-Christian philosophy is not possible. There is none. This was written by Joseph Piper in a book, All Philosophy is Christian. And when we understand Christian, if we zoom out and understand the political aspects, we understand that it's a Christendom. It's a system of domination and political expansionism. And we can see how it explains itself to itself that there is no other system possible. In the book, Pattberg writes, philosophy is concerned with problems regarding existence, values, mind, and language by a critical systematic approach that relies on logical argument and reason. There are, of course, other approaches to thinking that rely more on persuasion, intuition, compromise, memorization, storytelling, religion, or mythology. There are even approaches to thinking that rely on logical argument and reason that are not considered philosophy. For example, scientific thinking. Other approaches to thinking are less systematic and more spontaneous or creative, like poetry, music, and the fine arts. Learning is thinking too. Learning is not philosophy. Some forms of thinking are systematic but do not require an argument, for example, strategic thinking. Other forms of thinking are irrational or untruthful, yet they are just this, more thinking. Illogical or non-conclusive arguments are not considered philosophy, yet they are products of thinking too. And last, academic philosophy is distinguished from the activity philosophizing by a preset of technical terms and pre-existing concepts, curriculum, and methodology that takes years of study to internalize. The following community text, in a democracy, it is important what the masses know and told, is it not? Is a broad definition of what is considered philosophy as far as the internet encyclopedianists are concerned. Here's a quote: philosophy is distinguished from other ways of addressing fundamental questions such as mysticism or mythology or the arts of critical, generally systematic approach and its reliance on reasoned argument. And just to pause there, going back, I realized I was thinking about the translation of Confucius. And again, in Chinese, Confucius is actually called Kongzi. This is the word Kongzi. Kong is his family name. And Zi means master. So the translation to Confucius happened through a Jesuit tradition, came from a Jesuit, Matteo Ricci, in the 16th century, and it was under the attempt for standardization. And this notion of standardization, categorization, who came up with this categorization? We can think about the way that the Germans divvied up Africa, ignoring all previous cultures and lines and boundaries of people. It was the Germans that came up with the way in which these countries would be created and divvied amongst the European powers during the Berlin Conference. So we can see the power of who calls dibs and who gets to categorize, who gets to name, then who will get the power to understand and relate to the world. And another question that came up was this question of truth. Does anybody have the truth? And it's important to ask this question and to even fight for it. But what tends to happen in everyday discourse is it becomes so overwhelming and huge that we can just think, okay, well, you don't have the truth. No one has the truth, so let's not even go there. Yet at the same time, there is what we might refer to as the big other. You know, they're watching, or they say. Who is they? And before we fall into a rabbit hole of paranoia, the they is still important to understand and discuss, because actually a lot of times it's the legal standard or the school of thought that you're a part of, the community, your neighbors, social expectations. These are the they that we are engaging in. And so oftentimes with intercultural exchanges, this gets into a bit of a problem, because you might be from one tradition with certain expectations, and another person comes from a separate set of standards. And so one might default into the thinking that is given to you and say, well, they say we should do this. And the second person would think, no, what? My they says we should do that. And so it is important to understand and to really grasp which they we're talking about and what is the standards of which we take so often for granted, because it is difficult to wake up in the morning if we have to question everything every day. What is the meaning of life? And today, especially with the advancement or the integration of AI, also known as artificial intelligence, and some people argue that it's even, we can look at it as alien intelligence. But it's perhaps not so new. Perhaps it's only the advancements. What do I mean by that? In language, the language itself, we can understand, is already a form of alien. it is not us. We use the language to speak and to hopefully command others so that we can survive in this world and that we can navigate together with others. And this language was given to us, this language was defined, this language was operated before we were born. Hence the idea of the mother tongue. So what is truth? We could have a few different strategies to understand and get to so-called truth. One example I like to use is the usage of a map. If you and I were going on a trip, we want to go from A to point B, we could argue our personal preferences. But if we introduce a map, we could then have something external and something that we can decide and discuss the pros and cons of each way. But the next question comes, of course, which map do we use? Who created the map? What if the map is wrong? So with regards to truth and a system of thinking, one study is the study of hermeneutics or exegesis, which is the close reading and study of the Word of God or the Bible. But again, coming back to the original quote, that is Christian philosophy the only system that we can use? Is there an outside of a Christian philosophy? Let's continue with Pattberg. There we encounter Ji Xianlin's definition again, that the philosophical approach to thinking ideally leads to system building. Just pondering over parts of another person's philosophy does not constitute its own philosophy. Besides, only the creators of the most memorable philosophical systems, Plato, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Georg W.F. Hegel, Karl Marx, for example, are venerated as great philosophers. Yet no matter their initial novelty, to the best of our knowledge, none of the great philosophers, great philosophical systems, all purely intellectual inventions. We say Vorstellungen or representations, no doubt, seem to have passed the test of time. In fact, bombastic philosophical systems think Sartre's existentialism, Freud's self, Levi-Strauss' structuralism, Meinong's ontology, Ayn Rand's objectivism, or Nietzsche's superhuman come and go, and it is often the most easily impressionable students who take the rules of those systems as a matter of fact, thus run into the dangers of growing up dogmatic and intolerant, the disciples and enablers of another person's intellectual fantasy. So that's very humbling, this immediate labeling of another person's absolute systems as nothing more than intellectual fantasy. Yet at the same time, it's something to really consider. How serious are we about these systems? And what is the stake? At what point is it worth fighting or dying for? And constantly, I feel brought back to the urgency of this question, because let us not forget that as the recording of this, and pretty much most times, but in the acceleration of modern history, that this is all spoken with a backdrop of genocide and conquest. It literally is a matter of life and death. Continuing, in his essay, 思想家与哲学家, translated as Thinkers and Philosophers, the linguistic sage Ji Xianlin compared philosophers to scholars, non-philosophical thinkers, and observed the following, quote, once they, the philosophers, bring all their theories together and try to build them into a universal system, generally all philosophers have this ambition. Cracks will appear and flaws will be revealed, and the project will literally end in an embarrassment. Thinkers I have in mind are not like that. They have their own views on the things I have just mentioned. They would, however, neither engage in any system building or engage in its cumbersome analysis. I remember an old Chinese couplet from The Dream of the Red Chamber, 红楼梦. A thorough insight into worldly matters arises from learning. A clear perception of human nature emanates from literary lore. end quote. I believe that thinkers do just that. They cave for insights into worldly matters. They are sophisticated human beings. They do not talk about the mysterious and unpredictable, nor do they write obscure texts, and much less do they dream up philosophical systems. What they write down is moderate and peaceful, unpretending, and everyone understands their thought. After reading it, our eyes shine bright and blister. Our minds are clear and free of confusion, and we realize, yes, this is how things truly are. So in this first section, Pattberg already brought in a very interesting quote. It comes from the Dream of the Red Chamber from the Qing Dynasty. And this I just want to give some background to, because for the Chinese, in the Chinese culture, there are the four great novels. And this is actually what stands as the foundation for Chinese thought. And to understand history of this, these four books are constantly referenced back to understanding the world. So what are the four books? We have The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, The Water Margin, Journey to the West, and Dream of the Red Chamber. And notice that this is not such a focus on the authors themselves or the country or the nation. Rather, it is from the different dynasties. And it's interesting to note that these three are from the Ming Dynasty, from the 14th century, while the Dream of the Red Chamber is from the 18th century, from the Qing Dynasty. And this is really interesting to just start with this to contrast with the idea of nationhood. So to understand that which philosopher is from which country and from when, and to think about the importance around ethno-nationalism and a particular thought. And to remember that China is not one single country. It is a region. It is a kingdom. Well, even that is a Western label. Furthermore, we see that these four books are not treatises or works of philosophy or non-fiction, but rather they are all fiction. And I have a quote here from Jacques Lacan, La vérité a structure de fiction, which is truth has a structure of fiction. And this will be very interesting to just keep in the back of our minds, because we'll come back to this. What is truth? And what does fiction have to do with it? How does fantasy relate to our understanding of the world, and to, more importantly, to understand now is the function of ideology. Pattberg brings in a quote from the Bible, the New Testament, contrasting the false wisdom of sages is true wisdom, wisdom from God. God's wisdom is pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, and full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. James chapter 3, verse 17 to 18. This is a very interesting quote, because it brings in this idea that the Word of God, there's a constant attempt for reduction or purity, to find, perhaps, and this is later Hegel's project, to find the essence of things, to find the truth. And who might give the truth? Well, none other than God. And for the Christian project, there's this understanding of the house of God, a place of eminence, of a single source. Now, you might say, today we live in a secular world, and this is not so relevant. But where does this secular world come from? At least in the West, a lot of this, we have to understand, still comes from the Christian, or at least Abrahamic traditions. So just because we get rid of certain aspects that we think are superfluous, we must not forget that the secular project is just a reduced form of a Christendom political project. Pattberg provides an example with regards to philosophy in Germany today and the construct of the PhD degree. For example, the PhD degree is a doctor of philosophy. The state does not offer a doctor of sapientia, meaning the wise, from the Latin word sapere, to know, sagacity, sagehood. In fact, this word doesn't even make it to the German dictionary, as Pattberg suggests or discusses. Pattberg here writes, first, what had happened since the Greeks during the rise of Christianity in Europe that caused the exodus of Western sage culture? The Germans do not call no thinker einen Weisen for no reason. That title and designation had fallen into disgrace not by chance, but by systematic attack and suppression, as we shall see.